Coronavirus hypocrisy. So many people have noticed the remarkable flip in coverage of protests in the last couple of weeks related to the coronavirus pandemic. So prior to the death of George Floyd and the subsequent protests, any protests against the lockdowns, church meetings, all kinds of activities were vehemently denounced as extremely dangerous in the news media, by public health authorities, and various people, many of whom promptly flip flopped with the so called Black Lives Matter protests. And this has, of course, produced a lot of consternation and amazement, even among people pretty far on the liberal side or left wing, because it's such obvious hypocrisy. But this hypocrisy is not new at all. What I'm showing you here is a picture of workers hard at work directly across the street from where I live in Santa Clara County. And this is after the March 16th shelter in place order in Santa Clara County. One of the things that happened in the Bay Area in Northern California, including where I live in Santa Clara County, is that many construction projects of luxury apartment buildings, office buildings, many things that by no stretch of the imagination would be considered essential activities in a potential sort of Black Death pandemic scenario, were continued happily after the shelter in place order. Let me show some more pictures. This is a close-up of some plumbing going in here. I want to emphasize this was activity that went on 8 hours a day every weekday. So these are not rare incidents, maybe people delivering a few things and then leaving. These people were working all day. I'm at home. I get to listen to them banging, and there's something like 20 or 30 people in this building, mostly in the interior, banging away. And they were doing this for 3 weeks after the shelter in place order was issued. Nor was I an isolated case of this. It was going on all over the Bay Area. In fact, it got in the news, and there were a lot of complaints about it from many people, not just me. And I live in a densely populated neighborhood. There's a fair number of elderly people who live here, walk to work, things like that. And yet they had these guys working in close proximity. They're not going to church for an hour or two on Sunday. They're working together for 8 hours, 5 days a week, something like 40 hours. They work in close proximity. They're often inside. They have got to be in contact with one another all the time. And in fact, as you can see in these pictures, these are from March. They weren't wearing masks or any kind of real protective equipment. Now they do, which I will get to in a minute, but they were just going ahead and doing all this stuff. Here's more, some guys out front. A little bit farther back picture, the same kind of activity, more of it. More of it. You can see the people on the streets working around. Some more guys standing around. Here's some more of the plumbing. This is a close-up of a guy working up in the building. This is a local website, newspaper, and indeed, in practice, these shelter-in-place orders were not being applied to construction projects. Gardening, all kinds of clearly non-essential activities for about 3 weeks, 2 to 3 weeks afterward. Now, this generated significant controversy, and they did stop, I think, in response to complaints from many people in many different neighborhoods about projects like the one across the street from me that were going on. However, if they believe there was an unusually deadly, contagious super disease, which they are still claiming, months later, even though we now have good evidence that it's not as deadly as many of the numbers thrown around in March, nonetheless, if they believed this, they would, of course, have shut down all of these construction projects immediately. They clearly represent a substantial and unnecessary risk of spreading the disease. This, by the way, is a picture of our friendly neighborhood McLaren dealership. So it's a very ritzy neighborhood now. It's mostly Google people. In fact, what they're doing is tearing down the affordable housing for the poor people, bulldozing it, and putting up these luxury apartment complexes, which sometimes claim to have some affordable housing in them. I don't know what that means. But the actual practice in Mountain View is to get rid of the poorer people that don't have a lot of money, so the Google people and the Apple people and so forth can move into these fancy apartments. There's absolutely no basis for doing this. These are genuinely luxury, high-income apartment complexes that are being built right in the middle of this pandemic. And in fact, they place the neighbors, the people with money who live in the neighborhood, at greater risk. This is another shot from the street of the same construction. Here are the guys with the thing. Another close-up of a guy up in the building. And there are lots of stuff going on here. You can literally hear this. It's a problem for me working at home because you can literally hear these guys banging away day after day, all day. Now I can close the windows and put out some music, but it's annoying. Here we are. It's another close-up of a lot of equipment. I mean, it's not a small amount of stuff that they're doing here. This is an 8-hour-a-day project. They start around 7 in the morning, so it can wake you up in the morning, and they go until about 4 o'clock, pretty much nonstop. Now, I'm not faulting people for doing their job. I don't want people to be out of work. I definitely question this whole lockdown thing from the very beginning. It's not a very good policy. And really an incorrect response to the crisis. But if you believe what they claim they believe, what the authorities in Northern California seem to claim they believe, why was this ever allowed? Why weren't these shut down immediately on March 16th? Why did it take many complaints, reports in the news, and many people, neighbors, I mean, many people in residential areas are looking out their window and they're seeing this kind of stuff going on, and that's why it did, in fact, stop for a while. It resumed in May 1st with a new shelter-in-place order. They're back banging away across from me. But how does any of that make sense, especially if you're so concerned about scattered anti-lockdown protests in, Michigan, or, there's been a few here in California. They're not very large. They go for a couple of hours. They're not people working 8 hours a day in close proximity to one another like this, right? And yet, the same applies to churches. There are a couple of hours. The people are probably taking significant precautions. They're mostly peaceful. Certainly churches are almost always peaceful, but there was enormous outrage over churches, some funerals, some Orthodox Jewish activities, temple meetings, all this kind of stuff. I mean, there was huge publicity and shaming of people doing this, which are maybe once a week, once a month, once in a while activities for a short period of time, which were probably being conducted with considerable caution. And yet, it's okay for people to spend 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, in close proximity to one another, building luxury apartment buildings for people who don't need them. There's no rush on this. It can be set aside for a while, and yet they went ahead and did this. And this is not a political statement. This is not a protest over, police brutality or racism or any of those kind of things. This is just business. This is just people building luxury apartment complexes in a very wealthy neighborhood. So there's a real hypocrisy here that we see. This bizarre, situation with the protests of politicians who are screaming about, churches, then embracing these mass gatherings, in some cases with rioting and looting, but even if they're totally peaceful, they're bringing in very close proximity huge numbers of people from populations which actually seem to be at higher risk from the disease than, rich white people, and they're egging this on. This is clearly hypocrisy. It's clearly politically motivated. It is just not scientific at all. It doesn't really have a rational public health agenda behind it. But this is what we're seeing. So people, I think, need to sort of back up and think about how nutty some of this is. Now, in having the lockdown orders and having this idea that this is a super disease like the Black Death seemed to be in the 14th century, was for people in the 14th century who were often malnourished and had other issues. But it isn't anything like that. It's clearly not that deadly. It's clearly considerably less deadly than some of the original numbers and fears back in March. But people have gotten into an environment where they're in this fight or flight response, and they're not thinking clearly about what's going on. They're panicking, and they're being kept in a panic by sensational news coverage and statements by some political leaders, and I think by the reaction that a substantial fraction of the population has to President Trump and his tweets and his kind of bizarre behavior. But the reality is that people should calm down and think about this nutty behavior, this hypocrisy, this flaky behavior here. If your leaders are being flakes or they have some hidden agenda, it's all the more important and incumbent upon the people, upon us, to calm down and think about this stuff and think through the implications. And one of the implications is shutting down the global economy on a scale that's almost unparalleled. We've essentially created something like the Great Depression environment of the 1930s, which of course resulted in Nazi Germany and a world war, or at least a major contributing factor to the appearance of these things. Do we need to do this to deal with this disease, especially now that it's clear that it's not, it's not that deadly for most people? For most individuals under the age of 45, it's a tiny risk. It's not going to, fortunately, these people are not probably, they're probably mostly young and they probably themselves won't be hurt. The danger for the workers or for the protesters right now is not for themselves. The danger is their parents or their grandparents or older people that they interact with. But we're not dealing with that. We're having this weird, emotional, politicized reaction to the situation, and it is clearly political. It's become a pawn in the attempt to get Trump. Trump is just one guy. He's a weird guy, I admit it. He's kind of strange, and there's some unsettling things about him. But do you blow up the world to get Trump? Highly selective enforcement of the stay-at-home orders is not new, and there are various examples of it, such as here in Santa Clara County. This construction project, and I presume, and have seen others as well, but I presume many others, was restarted about May 1st and involves dozens, if not more, workmen in close proximity to each other, 8 hours a day every work day, so something like 40 hours a week. This is compared to many businesses, churches, and so forth that remain shut down. Restaurants are now being allowed to have outdoor seating where people have to sit 6 feet apart and so forth. This is an example of hypocrisy that does not involve protests or overtly political issues. It seems perhaps to involve construction companies and housing companies and projects which one might wonder if they are large campaign contributors to local, city, state, county authorities, politicians, and so forth. That would seem like a very likely situation. I don't know that. This kind of selectivity in the enforcement of these rules raises serious questions about either the authorities don't really believe what they're telling people, and it seems like the selective handling of the protests further demonstrates that, or they simply aren't thinking very carefully. Many people are not thinking very carefully. Indeed, very carefully is an understatement. The heavy, sensationalized, anxiety-inducing press coverage of the pandemic has pushed most of the human population, almost 7 billion people, into a sustained fight or flight response. When human beings don't think very clearly, our responses are panic. Our responses are equivalent to the responses of being physically attacked by a rival tribe or person or a tiger or some threat like that 15,000 years ago. Not modern civilization, but these are these primal instincts which are being constantly stoked by all of these events. By frequent video coverage of violence now with these protests, of things that look very scary, it's very likely that many people, including highly educated, intelligent people, are not thinking clearly. They are reacting on these primal instincts. The primal instincts take over. They suppress our higher cognitive function. They are designed to deal with immediate threats that we rarely encounter in the modern world in advanced civilized countries. They are sometimes encountered in accidents, such as during a car accident or the threat of an accident, slipping and falling. They are, of course, encountered in actual wars, but despite the war rhetoric, the pandemic is not a war. There is no attack, there are no weapons, there are no atomic bombs. This is an unwise and unnecessary and dangerous fight or flight response. The irrationality of it is manifesting in this selective enforcement of these rules, not just on protests, but also things like these construction projects and so forth. This should raise very deep concerns. Now, I don't know a way to completely shut down the environment, the social media reinforcement of the fight or flight response. It is probably very important that people individually do this, perhaps by simply turning off their social media despite the stay-at-home orders, by not watching YouTube, not looking at Facebook, taking a multi-day break, whatever it takes, to knock themselves out of this extremely dangerous response. Human beings, cognitive function declines, they become more paranoid, we're in a threat response environment, a mental environment that is designed to deal with things like being attacked by another tribe of human beings or by animals or situations like that, which this is not that type of situation. This concludes this video presentation. If you like this video, please click like. Please click subscribe and the notification bell if you would like to receive more content from us. You can avoid internet censorship by subscribing directly to our RSS news feed. Please consider sharing the link by email or on your website or blog, in addition to liking, upvoting, or sharing on increasingly censored, advertising beholden, and big company social media. We have encountered such censorship. Mathematical software is developing software to automate data analysis, reducing the risks of costly errors and improving results. You can support our work financially by subscribing on our Patreon page. Scan the QR code in the lower right corner to get the Patreon link. Our Patreon link is also in the show notes below.